Hi, it's Penny here, and today I'm going to be talking about all the books that I read in the month of December. I think I read about 14 books, although a lot of those were graphics and middle grade books and books I didn't like, but there were some good ones in there. And as usual, I am going to do this book battle style where I pair up all the books and I battle them against each other until we come up with the best book of the month. Although firstly, let's talk about the one book I DNF'd, which I'm not even going to bother putting into the battle for that reason. So that is Singularity by Charlotte Grimshaw. This is a book I picked up from a free little library. Little free library? What do they call those things? Anyway, I got this for free, which is lucky because I really ended up not liking it. Basically, I picked it up because the title is Singularity, which is a scientific concept I'm interested in, and also it's a New Zealand author. So this was meant to be like an anthology of short stories that are semi-connected, all set in New Zealand, and I mean it was that, but I kind of hated the way that all the stories were written. They felt very unfocused, and for short stories I need it to be really clear what the concept is that you're trying to get across, or like I need it to have something really interesting and cool in it, and this was not that. I think there was one story that I actually felt engaged in reading, and then after reading the other ones I just got to a point where I couldn't face reading anymore. So unfortunately, because I do like to support New Zealand authors where I can, unfortunately this one was not it. So then for our first battle, we're going to have two fantasy novels. We have The Fragile Threads of Power by V. Schwab up against The Heroes by Joe Abercrombie. So The Fragile Threads of Power was newly released this year. It's a spin-off series from the original Darker Shades of Magic trilogy, which I reread in preparation for this book coming out this year, and I did think A Darker Shade of Magic, the first book, really stood up on a reread. The second two, not so much, which should have been a sign. For starters, there's just no way that you could read this book without having read the original trilogy, even though it's kind of being marketed as a new trilogy following new characters. However, at least the first half of the book was focused on backstories of the original characters and what's happened to them over the 7 years between the two series. And I really don't know if those backstories would make sense to you if you didn't know what had happened in the original series. Also, I just don't think you would care unless you already have like a big connection to those original characters. As I said, I didn't really like the second and third books, and I'm also more of a plot-driven reader rather than a character-based reader, so the fact that the first 400 of about 550 pages was just backstories of the old characters and then backstories of the new characters. It was very slow. The writing is probably quite poetic, but in a way that to me felt very empty and lacking in substance. And I have been known to like some flowery writing at times, but this again was not it for me. I slogged through the whole 550 books because I had heard that right at the end it got super exciting, but I didn't think it did. There were some cool magical elements introduced throughout the story and kind of something happened with it right at the end, but for me it just felt really rushed, and I was frustrated that the cool magical stuff was just skipped through in a couple of chapters, and then the character stuff was like dragged out. And I really think all that character stuff could have been integrated better to the plot and just been a much better plot driven book, but also like I think it would have been better for exploring the characters as well, or at least that's what I would have preferred. So overall, quite boring. Then we have The Heroes by Joe Abercrombie. So this is a grimdark novel set in the First Law world. So there is an original trilogy in the First Law world that I've read and I really loved. Then there is 3 standalones before we get the second First Law trilogy, and The Heroes is the second standalone, and it tells the story of this 3-day battle between two forces, and it's just giving you lots of different perspectives of this battle. Now, I don't particularly like battle scenes, so going into this I was somewhat concerned that I wasn't going to like it, and I will say the battle scenes did frustrate me. I think Joe Abercrombie actually writes battle scenes fairly well, but I still get bored. That said, there was a lot of stuff happening throughout the story that did still keep me interested. There were points of listening to the audiobook where I know I did start to tune out, but there were things that would pull me back in, particular character perspectives that had some really interesting themes. I think sometimes Joe Abercrombie writes some really amazing lines that just seem to capture some kind of truth of life, or alternatively just are such dark sentiments that they still hit even when they don't feel true. So even though I would definitely wish that these books would have more of a plot, I still also think that you can see the threads coming together in the bigger world, and I really do have a lot of hope for that second trilogy, that all of the threads and all of the pieces he's laying in these original books are going to come to fruition at that point. Maybe they won't. Maybe Joe Abercrombie will crush all my hopes. I know that's probably what he would like to do, but for now, I'm still hopeful, and I still enjoyed this a lot more than I thought I was going to. So if we are battling these two books up against each other, I'm definitely going to pick The Heroes by Joe Abercrombie. Okay, then next we're going to have a battle of all the science fictions and thrillers that I read during the month. So we've got Defiant by Brandon Sanderson, up against How High We Go in the Dark by Sequoia Nagamatsu, up against One of Us Is Back by Karen M. McManus. So also two of these are YA, which I'm trying to read less of for reasons. But anyway, firstly, Defiant. This is the fourth and final book in the Skyward series, which is set in this world where humans have been chased onto this planet and forced to live underground, and anytime they try to leave, they get shot down by aliens. In the first book, we meet this girl named Spencer who really wants to join the Air Force and fight for her people, but because her father was in the Air Force and flew away during a battle, ran away, her family doesn't have a lot of respect, and she has to really fight to earn her place. I absolutely loved the first book, but then the rest of the books have really gone off in a different direction. I often feel like they're a bit silly. I do think Brandon Sanderson is trying to explore some really interesting ideas, but those ideas are so abstract and strange that I think they're really hard to explore, and I don't know that they mesh that well with a lot of the YA themes that he's also exploring, and just the silly universe that he's building up with all these different aliens. And I just think specifically for this fourth book, I was very introspective, especially in the beginning. It was either action scenes, battle scenes, or it was Spencer working through her thought processes, working through her feelings, and then talking to other people about their feelings and how that connects to her feelings. And it got quite repetitive as she talked to all these different people and thought about the same thing over and over again. There were some cool twists and turns along the way. It is still a Brandon Sanderson book, and I do still really love the slugs in this book series. Honestly, the saving grace of this book series has been the slugs, which is not something I ever expected to say. So I'm glad I've completed this series, but also I question whether I really should have. Then we have How High We Go in the Dark by Sequoia Nagamatsu. So this is another short story anthology where all the stories are interconnected. And these ones, basically a plague is released upon the earth, and we're just following all these different people as they struggle with the changes in the world, struggle with the grief of their loved ones dying. We get to see a lot about how the structure of the world changes as a result of so many deaths, which I thought was really interesting because I'm pretty sure that this book was written, I don't think it was released before COVID, but I think it was written before COVID. So it's interesting to compare and contrast to what really happened. And it is really quite dark in parts. There are some things that happen that are really, really awful, but there are also quite a few sci-fi elements introduced throughout it, which are really interesting. And like Defiant, some of them are really abstract, and especially the last story kind of changes the way you would look at all the previous stories. And I almost went back and reread the whole thing. Maybe one day. I definitely think there would be a major rereadability element to these stories. But also, beyond the darker elements and the sci-fi ideas, a lot of these stories are really just focused on human connection and how much people both need that and struggle with that, especially in darker times. So I've seen that this book doesn't have as high a rating as I had expected it would have, and I think I understand that because I don't think the ideas in these stories are going to hit with everyone, and I almost think that the people that it does hit with are going to wish that it had gone even further than it did. But some of these stories are just beautiful and dark, and I really enjoyed my experience. Then lastly for this battle, we have One of Us Is Back by Karen M. McManus. So this is a YA thriller. YA thrillers, as I said, I'm trying to read less YAs just because they don't tend to relate to me, or I don't relate to them as much anymore now that I'm a much older person. However, This is the third book in a trilogy, and I've just really enjoyed these books for some reason. I just find the characters to all be fun to hang out with. I think with a lot of adult thrillers, so many of the characters are really toxic, or the whole unreliable narrator thing, and I just don't really enjoy that. I much prefer thrillers with a bunch of characters who are doing their best. Even when they screw up, you can understand why, and like you can see that they're trying. And then when bad things happen to them, like you actually care about it rather than being like, oh, maybe they deserved it. So I had a great time with this. I also just think it does such a good job of like dropping all these little clues, or like having so many pieces to it, and then all those pieces come together. Some of them maybe are red herrings there to lead you astray, but other things come together in really surprising ways. Like right at the end, there were some twists and turns that made me gasp. I had a really great time with this whole series, but this book in particular, it was just great. I've just remembered I didn't tell you what it was about. So basically, in the first book, we have this group of high school students with detention, and then by the end of detention, one of the students is dead, and all the rest are now suspects, and we learn about all their secrets that they have been hiding, as well as learning what actually happened. Then in the second book, basically their younger siblings are victims of this truth and dare texting game that somebody set up. And finally, this third book, one of the characters who was guilty in the first book is now back in town because he's managed to gain a retrial, and then some other suspicious things start happening. I had a lot of fun with this. So if I'm going to be putting these three books up against each other, firstly we're going to take away Defiant, just bored me a little bit too much. I'm probably also going to take away How High We Go in the Dark, just because it didn't quite reach the potential I was hoping for, which means we're going to put One of Us Is Back through to the next round. Okay, then this next battle, I've basically put all the cuter, more whimsical books that I read together. So firstly we have the second two books in the Howl's Moving Castle trilogy by Diana Wynne Jones, up against Karen's Haircut by Katy Farina, up against Unfamiliar Volumes 1 and 2 by Hayley Newsome. Okay, firstly let's start with the Howl's Moving Castle trilogy. So I reread Howl's Moving Castle in the month of November, and then in December I continued and completed the trilogy. Although these books are only kind of like spin-off books really, although mainly just the main characters from the first book have cameos in the second and third books, but we follow primarily new characters. So in Castle in the Air, we follow this carpet salesman who's always like dreamt of this fictional past for himself, that he's like some lost prince. Then somebody does sell him this magic carpet, which leads him to meet this princess that he feels like he's always dreamt of. And then he ends up going on a bit of a quest to save her. Honestly, this one was a lot of fun, but I didn't like it as much, mainly because this carpet merchant's motivation was primarily that he was in love with this princess, even though he barely knew her, and like he mostly fell in love with her because she was the woman of his dreams. And just most of the time, to me, it felt like she was an object of desire rather than a real person. There were some bits in there where it tried to make her a real person, and of course she would be a real person. But anyway, I didn't really like his motivation, but there were some really cool elements. I love the way the original characters from the first book were incorporated. There were some cool twists and turns along the way. Like, again, I think Diana Wynne Jones is really good at like having a bunch of little elements introduced and then bringing them together in a really clever way at the end of the story. But I just didn't connect with the characters of Castle in the Air as much. However, then we have The House of Many Ways. So in this, we're following this young girl called Charmaine. She always just lived at home, and her mother has never really taught her any life skills because she's just expected to be respectable. But then her auntie basically meddles and arranges for her to house sit for her distant uncle who's a wizard, and his house is completely run by magic. So she turns up, has no idea about how to do magic or how to do basic life stuff. The dishes are like overflowing, there's rubbish everywhere, everything's a complete disaster, and she just has to figure out what's going on. This one I really loved, especially the way the house works. So in this house, it seems like initially there's only 2 rooms in the house, but depending on how you go through the door between these rooms, you can end up in all sorts of other places. And just the way the magic worked was so whimsical and so fun. There's also a bigger mystery going on and a bunch of magical creatures. And again, cameos from the characters from the first two books, and it was just so much fun, so satisfying how it all came together in the end, and just also so satisfying just to go along with Charmaine's journey about learning how to live life, and I really liked it. So actually, I'm really only going to consider The House of Many Ways for this battle. Then I also picked up the latest release of the Babysitter's Little Sister graphic novel adaptations. So the Babysitter's Club books were my favorite books when I was a kid in the 80s, basically following this group of babysitters and all their learnings and hijinks. And then the Little Sister series followed one of these girls' little sister, who's very outgoing and imaginative. And in this book, basically she starts feeling like she doesn't look how she wants to look, then she gets a haircut, it doesn't go well, and she learns a lesson. These books are always about a lesson to learn. The one thing that was very weird in this particular one, that I do remember being weird in the original, although I read the original when I was very young, so I think I didn't quite grasp the weirdness of it. Basically in these books, Karen's friend and this other boy are planning to get married, and near the end of the book they actually have a wedding, and there's like adults there taking photos, like they've got proper wedding outfits, and I'm just reading it totally confused, like why are these 7-year-olds, 8-year-olds having a wedding that seems to be like a big deal, like it's a real wedding. It's super weird, and honestly just a massive distraction for the rest of the book, which is about, you know, learning to deal with what happens if you don't look exactly like you want to look, and like learning to love yourself however you look. Honestly, it was just super weird. So I had fun. It was still a nostalgic fun time, but also really weird. Then lastly, we have Unfamiliar. So I think I actually read the first volume back in like September or something, and very luckily, because I love that, the second volume just came out and I managed to get my hands on it from the library. I reread the first volume, so I was ready to go into the second one, and I loved it again. This is about this group of witchy girls who struggle with their magical abilities, and one of them moves to a new town, they all make friends, and they're just super adorable, but also like with that little witchy darkness to it. The main plot in the first book is kind of based around this haunted house and a bit of a murder mystery. Then in the second volume we have the introduction of a fairy king is interfering with this curse that is set on one of our characters. And I will say I didn't love the second volume as much as the first one. Firstly, I'm not sure it was as long, but also I did feel like at times in the second volume the art wasn't as consistent, especially one of our characters kind of has siren powers, and I think it's because the creator was trying to draw her as really sexy and beautiful, but it kind of always took me out of the story because the art style just didn't quite seem right. And I know that in the first volume there were parts where she was also drawn as like sexy and beautiful, and I don't think it had the same problem. So overall, I think I like the story of the first volume better, but I did still really love the second volume. These witchy girls are just so cute. The world that they live in is so adorable. It's great. So I definitely still recommend the first volume, and then if you've read the first volume, you will still want to read the second volume, even if you know it's not quite as good. So if we're putting these three books up against each other, as I said, I'm only going to put House of Many Ways up against the others. So firstly, we'll take off the Babysitter's Little Sister one because 8-year-old weddings are weird. And then really out of the other two, I'm going to pick The House of Many Ways, just because I think it was just as good as the first book, Howl's Moving Castle, whereas Unfamiliar 2 didn't quite manage that. So that means we're putting The House of Many Ways through to the next round. Okay, then let's wrap up the rest of the graphic novels I read. So we've got The Night Eaters by Sana Takeda and Marjorie Liu up against Nimona by N.D. Stevenson, and The Promised Neverland Volume 5 by Kaiu, Shirai and Posuka Demizu. So firstly, The Night Eaters. This is actually Volume 1, which is called She Eats the Night, and I never know how to describe this one, especially because so much of what happens is a surprise. Primarily we're following these two twins who are running this restaurant, and their mother and father during COVID have moved back with them to just support them, and now the parents have decided that the kids need to be a little bit tougher. We're also getting flashbacks to the parents when they're younger and meeting, and you realize that the mother is like a total badass, and maybe there's a little bit more to it, like a magical element. So the mother basically gets these twins to help her deal with this like house across the street, which is all really overgrown. Is it haunted? Maybe. There's some really dark elements to this, but primarily it's just a story about this mother and her children feeling like they're a disappointment to her and like they can never be good enough for her. So in a lot of ways it's a really relatable story, but it's also really strange and really dark. I have got a hold on the second volume, so hopefully my library will find a way to get that to me soon. Oh, I will say, actually, I picked this up because Sana Takeda and Marjorie are the creators of the monstrous graphic novels that I really love, and I especially love those ones for the art. I will say the Night Eaters is kind of similar in art style, but probably more to the messier, like less clear panels in the monstrous graphic novels, whereas the monstrous ones sometimes there's certain like full page art which is absolutely amazing. I think there was less of that in the Night Eaters. So then we have Nimona, and I am really behind the game on this one. I picked this up just because I saw it at my library, but just after I saw it I realized that it has been made into a movie recently. I'm not actually sure. Has it been released? Is it going to be released? I don't know. I think it's going to be released this year. Anyway, I now love the story and I will definitely be finding out how I can watch that movie. Although, will it live up to the graphic novel? I don't know. But basically, we're following Nimona, who really wants to be the sidekick for this supervillain, and Nimona is a shapeshifter. And the villain really doesn't want her to be his sidekick, but she is very persistent in taking on this position. We also have this other knight. So originally the supervillain was also training to be a knight, and he was best friends with this knight, but now of course something happened and they're on opposite sides of things. Maybe the villain isn't as villainous as you might expect, and maybe there's more to Nimona than you might expect. I think the story was just so much fun right from the beginning, but then the plot went in ways that I wasn't expecting, and I really enjoyed this, and especially the emotional story of the whole thing. And as well, I think the art style was really well suited to the story that it's trying to tell. Then we have The Promised Neverland Volume 5. This is a series about these orphans that live in this orphanage, but some things seem a little bit off about it, and when they find out what's going on, they decide they need to escape the orphanage. In a lot of ways, it's very similar to Death Note in the way that the characters are working through the logic of all their different schemes, and there's different characters basically having a battle of wits against each other. If you've seen me talk about this series previously, I was very frustrated that after having read 4 volumes, they still hadn't managed to get outside of the orphanage, and we hadn't learnt much about the world outside of the orphanage. But volume 5, that did change, and I'm very glad to be getting some momentum in the series again. I will say, at the end of this one, I was very frustrated about the hold queues at my library to continue the series, so I just put a hold on quite a lot of them. So hopefully in January 2024, this month, I'll be able to get through a decent amount more, and now that we're learning more about the world and like getting that momentum going, I'm hoping I'm going to really love it. Because there is so much about this world that's really interesting, and the characters, these orphans, are so adorable but also so clever. So this is a 20 volume series, and I was starting to think, I don't know if I'll be able to make it through all 20 volumes, but now volume 5 saved the day. I am excited once again. So if we're putting these 3 graphic novels up against each other, firstly I will take away The Promised Neverland. Even though I liked it and I'm glad we're making momentum, each story still just doesn't have quite enough substance for me in it, but I am still hopeful that will change going forward. Then we've got The Night Eaters versus Nimona. Even though I did enjoy The Night Eaters, I think I just can't not choose Nimona because it was so much fun, and just the way the story took you on such an emotional journey. Nimona has to go through to the next round. Okay, then before we pick the best book of the month, let's do a little semi-final round. So firstly, we've got The Heroes by Joe Abercrombie up against One of Us is Back by Karen M. McManus. And this is a little bit of a hard battle just because the books are so different. If I'm honest, I was much more engaged during my reading experience of One of Us is Back. And I do think that book is really clever, the way everything comes together, but I probably would also say that of The Heroes. What I didn't mention when I talked about it at the beginning of the video is that it does do some surprising things at the end. I think often Joe Abercrombie kind of sets up a typical fantasy story, and you know what the typical fantasy outcome would be, and so you're expecting that that's not what's going to happen, that he's going to surprise you, but every time he surprises me in a way that I'm not expecting. Like, I think this is what I'm expecting, so he'll probably do this, and then he does that instead, like something completely not what I was expecting. And it does make the story really enjoyable, just satisfying when you get to the end and you find out what's happened. Even though, like, in some ways it's depressing because the characters never get, like, the hero's journey that you might expect them to get. That would be satisfying from a, like, oh yeah, good wins out in the end. This is grimdark, good does not win out in the end. But as I said as well, I just think Joe Abercrombie has some really great writing, some really great lines. So I think even though I was more engaged while I was reading One of Us Is Back, and I just think the characters in that were really good people, really great. The heroes, not great people. But overall, I think it was a better book. So I'm going to pick the heroes to go through to the finals. And then we're going to have The House of Many Ways by Diana Wynne Jones up against Nimona by N.D. Stevenson. This is another really difficult battle because I really loved Nimona right from the start to the end, and I think the story was so clever. And then there were parts of The House of Many Ways that I did feel were a little bit slower, or like just a few parts that didn't interest me as much as the rest. But also, I just loved the magic in The House of Many Ways so much, and I really did think everything came together in such a satisfying way at the end. But I was very satisfied with the end of Nimona as well. This is one of these ones where the battle could go either way and probably would go a different way on a different day. But I think for today, I'm going to pick Nimona because I do think overall it's a better story. And I think, like, if I was going to recommend one of these, I think Nimona is one that a lot more people, like, it would have more mass appeal. So we're going to pick Nimona. Right, which means we're up to the finals. We're going to put The Heroes by Joe Abercrombie up against Nimona by N.D. Stevenson. And I think this is really hard just because Nimona is not that long. Like, it's a longer graphic novel, but it's still just a graphic novel. And then you're comparing it to this, like, massive 500-page book, which has so much complexity to it. And even though Nimona does have some darkness to it, it's always in kind of a fun way, mostly. Whereas The Heroes is not fun at all, but I kind of almost like that better. And do you know what? I think I'm going to pick The Heroes as the best book of the month, which is 100% not what I was expecting, but here we are. So let me know if you've read any of the books I talked about in this video, because I would love to talk with you about them down in the comments below. Also, let me know if you read anything exciting in the month of December, so I'd love to chat with you about that as well. And do subscribe if you'd like to see any more of my bookish videos. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you are doing well, and I will see you next time.